I'm Sergeant Bella Bailey. I'm 33 years old, and 10 years ago, my sister Chloe left her newborn baby, Aria, on my doorstep with a scribbled note and disappeared. When I called for help, my father coldly ordered, "You're a soldier, treat it like a mission, don't bother us." I raised my niece as my own daughter, and together we built a beautiful life. Then Chloe came back with my parents, suing me for custody, claiming I had torn them apart. Today, at the hearing, after they painted me as an unstable soldier of a mother, I presented the judge with a small metal box. His eyes widened as he glanced inside, then he asked, "Do they know you have these?" I just shook my head. Before I continue my story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe that sacrifice is worth more than blood, hit like and subscribe. Because this story will redefine for you the true meaning of the words family and honor. 10 years earlier, my world had an order. It had a rhythm. It smelled of gun oil and discipline. On a damp October night, the kind where the North Carolina humidity sticks to your skin like a second uniform, I was sitting on the hardwood floor of my small off-base house, methodically cleaning my M4. Each click of the bolt carrier group settling back into the upper receiver was a familiar, comforting sound. It was the sound of control, of purpose. Outside, a low rumble echoed from the distant training ranges of Fort Bragg, what we jokingly called Fort Bragg's lullaby. It was the soundtrack to my life, a life I had built on precision, structure, and the unwavering certainty of the chain of command. Then, the doorbell rang. The sharp, piercing chime sliced through the quiet rhythm of my evening. It was jarring, out of place. No one just drops by, not here. I laid the rifle components carefully on the cleaning mat, my movements economical, ingrained by years of training. I walked to the door, my senses on alert. Through the peephole, all I could see was the yellow glare of the porch light on the wet concrete steps. I opened the door to a wall of damp, earthy air. And there, sitting directly in the middle of my doormat, was a baby's car seat. For a moment, my mind refused to process the image. It was a foreign object in my tactical world. Inside the seat, a tiny form stirred under a thin blanket. A crumpled piece of paper was tucked beside its head. My heart began to pound a frantic, disorderly rhythm against my ribs. I knelt, my knees cracking, and picked up the note. The handwriting was a chaotic scrawl, a signature of my sister, Chloe. "Her name is Aria. I'm so sorry. You're the strongest person I know." Strong. The word hit me not like a compliment, but like a lead weight to the gut. Being strong wasn't a choice, it was the role I'd been assigned my whole life. And right now, it felt less like a virtue and more like a life sentence. I unbuckled the impossibly small straps and lifted the baby into my arms. She was lighter than my rifle. The scent of sour milk and rain filled my nostrils, an invasive smell that instantly began to overwrite the familiar comfort of oil and metal. My world of discipline had just been shattered by an order that wasn't in any field manual. A quick search of the car seat revealed a cheap diaper bag. Inside, 4 diapers, a half-used pack of wipes, and a can of powdered formula that was 2 weeks from its expiration date. That was it. That was the sum total of Chloe's maternal forethought. The sheer carelessness of it ignited a hot flash of anger in my chest. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, my fingers suddenly clumsy on the screen. I dialed home to Charlotte. A desperate, foolish part of me prayed for panic on the other end of the line, for a shred of concern, for family. The phone rang 3 times before my father picked up. I explained the situation, my voice tight and strained, the words tumbling out in a rush. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. It stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, my father's voice came through, flat and devoid of any emotion, as if he were discussing a minor inconvenience with the cable company. "That's Chloe's mess, not ours," he said, his tone unwavering. "You're a soldier, Bella. Treat it like a mission. Don't bother us with it." Before I could even process the blow, my mother's voice chirped on the line, somehow even worse. "Bella, honey, you've always known how to take care of yourself. You have a salary, a stable home. What does Chloe have?" They didn't ask if the baby was okay. They didn't ask how I was. They didn't ask a single question. They just closed the door, locking it from the inside. I hit the end call button, the plastic of the phone feeling slick in my sweaty palm. The cold that washed over me had nothing to do with the October rain. One last hope. Jake, Captain Carter, my Jake. We were comrades. We'd shared watch duty in the freezing rain and training exercises under the blistering sun. He, more than anyone, should understand. I called him. Again the long silence after I explained. But this silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of gears turning, of calculations being made. "Bella," he finally said, and his voice had a new, cautious edge to it. "A kid? That's a complication. You know how a dependent affects deployment, affects a career path, affects promotion." He wasn't seeing a helpless baby in need of protection. He was seeing a logistical problem, a variable that screwed up the operational plan for his career, and by extension, mine. He was looking at a liability. He came over that night. He didn't look at the baby sleeping in the makeshift crib I'd fashioned from a laundry basket. He just packed the few things he kept at my place into a duffel bag. "I just need some space to think," he said, his eyes avoiding mine. It was the coward's farewell. I knew it was the last time I'd see him. He walked out the door and didn't look back, leaving me in a silence deeper and more profound than any I had ever known. That night, the longest night of my life, I sat on the floor, Arya sleeping in my arms. The distant thunder of artillery practice, Fort Bragg's lullaby, didn't sound comforting anymore. It sounded hostile, alien. I looked down at the tiny, perfect face nestled against my chest and felt a terrifying combination of raw fear and something else, something I couldn't yet name. It was responsibility. Not the kind that comes with a rank and a set of orders, but something primal. Chloe had given me a mission. And a soldier never abandons a mission. But for the first time in my life, I had no backup. No support. No one was coming. As I sat there in the dark, the cold floor pressing into my bones, a single, agonizing question began to form in the ruins of my orderly world. Why? Why was I always the one left to clean up the mess? Why did I always have to be the strong one? The question echoed in the crushing silence of the house, a ghost haunting the space between the floorboards and the ceiling. Why did I always have to be the strong one? In the sleepless early hours of the morning, with Arya finally quiet against my shoulder, the question wasn't just a lament. It was a mission briefing. It sent me back in time, on a reconnaissance mission into my own past, searching for the origin point of the role I'd been forced to play. My mind, trained to analyze, to map out terrain, began to chart the landscape of my own family. And for the first time, I saw the map of favoritism laid out with devastating clarity. It started with small things, the kind you brush off as a kid. I was 14, and I wanted a mountain bike more than anything. It was a Schwinn Mesa, cherry red, and it represented freedom. My father, a man who viewed life through the lens of a balance sheet, gave me a familiar line. "Money doesn't grow on trees, Bella," he said, not unkindly, just stating a fact. You want something, you earn it. So I did. I took a paper route, waking up before dawn all summer long, the cold morning air biting at my face as I pedaled my rickety old bike through the quiet suburban streets of Charlotte. The weight of the newspapers in the basket was a constant, satisfying ache in my muscles. By August, I had the money. The bike was mine. I had earned it. That same fall, Chloe failed an art class. Her tears were a dramatic, house-shaking event. My parents didn't tell her to try harder or study more. Instead, they took her to the art supply store and bought her a professional-grade easel and a set of expensive oil paints. "You have a gift, sweetheart," my mother cooed, stroking her hair. "Don't let a silly grade discourage your talent." I stood by, watching, the calluses on my hands from the bike's handlebars suddenly feeling rough and clumsy. It was then I understood the fundamental operating procedure of our family. My effort was expected, a given. Chloe's feelings were a fragile, precious commodity that had to be protected at all costs. I was the workhorse. She was the orchid in the greenhouse. The map became clearer a few years later with 2 letters. Mine came in a crisp, formal envelope bearing the seal of the United States Military Academy at West Point. An appointment to West Point. It was an honor, a monumental achievement that I had bled for through years of perfect grades and grueling physical training. I handed the letter to my father. He read it, his face impassive, and gave a single, curt nod. He turned to my mother and said, as if I wasn't even in the room, "Well, at least we don't have to worry about her tuition." It wasn't praise, it was a cost-benefit analysis. My success was measured in dollars saved. A month later, Chloe's letter arrived. It was from a small, obscure liberal arts college with a non-competitive arts program. My parents threw a party. They bought a sheet cake from Harris Teeter and invited the neighbors. I remember my mother, beaming with pride, telling Mrs. Henderson from next door, "Chloe is following her passion. We're just so proud that she's chasing her dream." They were proud of a vague, uncertain dream. But my tangible, hard-won achievement was merely a practical solution to a financial problem. The line between us was no longer invisible. It was a deep, uncrossable canyon. On one side stood duty and responsibility. On the other, privilege and passion. The final coordinates on the map were drawn by a phone call. I was a private first class at the time, living off a salary that barely covered my expenses. Chloe called me from some city out west, sobbing, saying she was broke and couldn't pay her rent. Without a second thought, I wired her almost everything I had saved, leaving myself with just enough to eat ramen for the rest of the month. When I later asked my parents why they hadn't helped her, my mother sighed that long-suffering sigh I knew so well. "Honey, sending her money just enables her. You're the older sister, you're more responsible. It's better coming from you." There it was, the mission statement they had written for me. I wasn't just their daughter, I was Chloe's safety net, the designated problem solver, the unpaid, unthanked third parent tasked with managing the consequences of their failure to raise her. They didn't teach her responsibility, they outsourced it to me. Pacing the floor with the warm, sleeping weight of Arya in my arms, the fragments of memory clicked together like the action of my M4. The truth settled not with a bang, but with a quiet, hollow ache. I was never the daughter they wanted. I was too disciplined, too self-reliant, too practical. I didn't need them, and my independence felt like a rejection of their role as protectors. Chloe, with her manufactured crises and emotional chaos, was the one who made them feel needed, made them feel like parents. Their love for me was the calm, detached affection one has for a safe stock market investment. Their love for Chloe was the frantic, desperate love for a high-risk, high-drama passion project. And Arya, this innocent child sleeping in my arms, was, in their eyes, just another piece of collateral damage from that failed project. I stopped pacing and looked down at her. They had built this box for me, labeled it the strong one, and sealed me inside it. But looking at Arya, I knew I couldn't let her grow up in its shadow. The past was a map that explained how I got here, but it wasn't going to be the map for where we were going. The resentment in my chest slowly cooled, hardening into something else. Resolve. The question was no longer why. The question now was what. What do I do now? Resolve is a cold, hard thing. It doesn't leave room for tears or second-guessing. The morning after Jake walked out, after a night spent staring into the darkness, the answer to the question of what now was waiting for me in the first rays of dawn. It was a single, terrifying, and unavoidable course of action. I looked at Arya, sleeping peacefully in her laundry basket crib, and I knew that the life I'd meticulously planned, the path of an infantry soldier, defined by deployments and field exercises, was over. The mission had changed. With my uniform pressed to perfect creases, I walked into my company commander's office. Captain Miller was a good man, a leader I respected immensely, which made what I was about to do feel like a profound betrayal of everything I was. I stood at attention before his desk. "Sir, I need to officially request a transfer to a non-deployable position." The words felt like ash in my mouth. For a soldier like me, this was the equivalent of willingly benching yourself during the championship game. It was admitting a weakness, a limitation. I braced myself for the questions, for the look of disappointment. Instead, Captain Miller leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment, his eyes holding not judgment, but a deep, weary understanding. He looked at me, then gestured vaguely towards the world outside his window. "Sergeant," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "This is the bravest mission you'll ever take on." In that moment, he didn't see a soldier compromising her career. He saw a human being making a necessary sacrifice. I felt a sharp sting behind my eyes, but I held it back. The pain of the decision was still there, but his words made it a clean wound, a necessary pain. My life became a relentless logistical operation on a new kind of battlefield. The enemy was exhaustion, and it was everywhere. Sleep deprivation was a more formidable foe than any training exercise. I tried to impose military order on the chaos of a newborn. I drew up feeding schedules on a whiteboard, a miniature operations plan. I stacked diapers with the precision of ammunition magazines. But discipline is no substitute for experience. I was in uncharted territory, without a map, without a squad. There were nights, huddled in a rocking chair in the dark, where the only sounds were Arya's inconsolable cries and my own silent, desperate sobs. The feeling of failure was a physical weight, heavier than any rucksack, more crushing than the Carolina heat. One afternoon, in the dim, humming quiet of the house, I had the radio on for some background noise. A preacher's booming voice filled the room. It was T.D. Jakes. I wasn't particularly religious, but I was desperate enough to listen to anything. "Your destiny," he declared, "is not tied to the people who walked away." The words cut through my fatigue and lodged themselves directly in my soul. Not tied to the people who walked away. My parents. Chloe. Jake. The phrase became a quiet mantra, a piece of intelligence I clung to in the trenches of my exhaustion. The real reinforcements arrived a few days later, not with a sermon, but with a smile. I was at the PX, the on-base supermarket, trying to maneuver a wobbly shopping cart with a screaming Arya strapped to my chest. I felt like a mess. My hair was a wreck, I probably had spit up on my shoulder, and I was on the verge of abandoning the cart and its contents right there in the aisle. Suddenly, a woman with kind eyes and a calm presence appeared beside me. It was Maria, the wife of a master sergeant from my old unit. "You look like you could use a support squad," she said gently. Her use of military slang was deliberate, a signal that she understood. She saw me not as a charity case, but as a fellow soldier in a tough spot. The following Saturday, my doorbell rang. It was Maria, and behind her stood a small platoon of other Army wives. They came armed not with rifles, but with casseroles, bags of diapers, and a mountain of gently used baby clothes. They were the Family Readiness Group, the FRG, an organization I'd always known about, but never thought I'd need. These women, many of whose husbands were deployed in Afghanistan, facing dangers I could only imagine, were here for me. They didn't pry or ask nosy questions about where Arya came from. They didn't offer pity. They just showed up. They took turns holding Arya so I could take a shower. They brewed a fresh pot of coffee and just sat with me, sharing stories and practical advice about surviving infancy. The tears that finally fell that afternoon weren't tears of sadness or failure. They were tears of overwhelming, soul-shaking gratitude. That single act of kindness was the foundation stone for my new life. Maria and the FRG became my family. They understood the unique loneliness and sacrifice of military life in a way no civilian ever could. They taught me how to navigate the on-base daycare system, pointed me to family support services, and most importantly, they showed me that family is a verb. It isn't defined by blood, it's defined by action, by showing up, by providing cover fire when a comrade is pinned down. My weekends transformed. Instead of suffocating silence, my little backyard was filled with the sounds of life. We'd have BBQs, the air thick with the all-American smell of grilling burgers and hot dogs, the sound of kids laughing and shrieking as they ran through sprinklers. These women, these strangers who became sisters, helped me build a fortress. It wasn't made of brick and mortar, but of shared experience, unconditional support, and an abundance of love. It makes you think, doesn't it? Sometimes the people who are supposed to be in your corner are the first to leave, and a total stranger becomes your lifeline. If you've ever had a Maria in your life, someone who showed up when you needed them most, I want you to honor them right now. Hit that like button for all the chosen families out there, and in the comments, just write the name of your Maria. Let's fill this space with their names. There, in the heart of Fort Bragg, one of the most demanding military installations in the world, I found my sanctuary. It was a fortress built by unlikely allies, a testament to the fact that sometimes the strongest families are the ones you choose. The years that followed were built on the foundation those women helped me lay. The chaos of infancy slowly gave way to the predictable rhythms of childhood. The frantic, sleepless nights were replaced by a new cadence, a life defined not by crisis, but by the steady, comforting beat of routine and love. We had survived the initial ambush, secured our perimeter, and now, in the quiet years that followed, we built a life. We created our own traditions, rituals that became the bedrock of our little world. Friday night was our sacred time. I'd pick up a large pepperoni pizza from the Domino's on Skibo Road, and we'd have what we called Friday night mission debrief. We'd spread a thick quilt on the living room floor, and with a Disney movie playing softly on the TV, I'd look at Arya, her face serious, and ask, "All right, Private Arya, what's your weekly sit rep?" And she would report on her mission at the on-base elementary school, her eyes wide with the importance of it all. She'd tell me about playground alliances, spelling test victories, and the intricate details of the finger paintings she'd created. We built our own little kingdom in that small rented house, a place governed by two simple laws: love and pepperoni pizza. There was a quiet joy in those moments, a profound sense of peace that I had never known before. It was a happiness I hadn't inherited or been given. It was a happiness I had fought for, inch by bloody inch. Arya grew up as a proud army brat, and the rhythm of Fort Bragg was the only music she knew. She could tell the difference between the deep whump-whump of a Black Hawk and the heavier double-rotor beat of a Chinook helicopter passing overhead. She knew that the clear, crisp notes of Réveillé played over the base-wide speakers at dawn meant it was time to wake up, and the solemn notes of retreat at 5 o'clock meant the duty day was done. She never saw this life as lacking. To her, it was a world of heroes. Her world. I will never forget the Veterans Day parade when she was 6. She stood on the sidewalk, clutching a small American flag, her face a mask of concentration as my unit marched past. When she saw me, her face exploded into a grin. "That's my mom," she yelled, her small voice cutting through the sound of the marching band. "My mom's a soldier." In that instant, every sacrifice, every difficult choice, every moment of doubt, it all crystallized into a single, perfect point of pride. I hadn't just given her a home. I had given her something more valuable than any trust fund. I had given her a legacy of honor. The hard questions came, as I always knew they would. When she was 7, sitting on the edge of her bed one night, she asked about her other mother. I had prepared for this mission. I pulled out a small photo album I'd made, its pages filled with pictures of her first few years. Tucked in the back were a couple of carefully chosen photos of Chloe, smiling, from a time before everything fell apart. I sat beside her, the weight of her small body warm against my side. "This is your Aunt Chloe," I said softly, my voice even. "She gave you to the world, Arya, and that was the greatest gift anyone could give. But at that time in her life, she wasn't ready for a mission as big as being a mom. So she gave that mission, the most important mission of all, to me. And it is the honor of my life to carry it out." I told her the truth, but I told it through a soldier's lens. I focused on the mission, not the failings of the person who assigned it. That peace, however, was occasionally disturbed by ghosts from my past. My parents would visit sometimes, usually just a brief stop on their way to their annual vacation at Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. Those visits were always tense, layered with unspoken accusations. They would arrive bearing expensive, inappropriate gifts for Arya. A designer dress for a girl who lived in shorts and t-shirts, a delicate porcelain doll for a girl who preferred climbing trees. It was their way of trying to buy absolution, to cover their emotional absence with material things. They'd walk through my small, tidy home with critical eyes, their gazes lingering on the modest furniture. They'd make subtle comments about my desk job, my stalled career. Is it really healthy for a child to grow up around all these guns and soldiers? My mother asked once, her voice dripping with condescending concern. They never saw the joy in Arya's eyes after a day spent with friends at the community pool. They never felt the fierce loyalty of the military community that had become our family. They looked at our life and saw only what they wanted to see. A deviation from their definition of a normal family, a life chosen out of necessity, not love. And in their polite, critical silence, I could feel the old chill returning, a faint, distant rumble that warned of a storm gathering just over the horizon. The peace was a fragile thing. I knew that. In the army, you learn that prolonged quiet is often just the precursor to an attack. And the attack on my quiet life arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, not with the roar of an engine, but with the silent, predatory glide of a pearl-white Tesla pulling up to my curb. It was the kind of car you see in magazines, a spaceship dropped into my world of sensible sedans and pickup trucks. The driver's side door opened and Chloe emerged. I almost didn't recognize her. The chaotic, frayed girl I remembered was gone, replaced by a polished, curated version. Her blonde hair was sleek and professionally styled. Her designer dress looked like it cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Beside her was a tall, handsome man in a fitted blazer who radiated the effortless confidence of California tech money. This was Trevor, her husband. They looked like a power couple from a lifestyle blog, and they were standing on my lawn. Chloe's recovery story, when she told it, was as flawless and glossy as her car. She'd gotten clean, found stability, found Trevor. There were tears, of course, scripted apologies for the past, pleas for a chance to get to know the daughter she had abandoned 9 years ago. A small, treacherous part of my heart, the part that had always wished for a sister, wanted to believe it. It was a flicker of hope, a tiny, dangerous flame in the battle-hardened fortress of my emotions, whispering that maybe, just maybe, she had finally grown up. Against my better judgment, I agreed to supervised weekend visits, and they played their parts to perfection. They were the fun, glamorous aunt and uncle. They took Arya on shopping sprees to the mall in Raleigh, buying her things I could never afford. They dined at expensive restaurants where the menus didn't have prices. My daughter, a girl whose greatest joy was a Friday night pizza on the floor, was dazzled by this sudden influx of material wealth. Trevor, with a politician's smile permanently affixed to his face, would say things like, "We just want to make up for lost time," or, "She deserves to be spoiled a little." But his eyes, when they met mine over Arya's head, were cold and analytical. They weren't the eyes of a doting uncle. They were the eyes of a man assessing a target. My internal threat level began to rise. Something was wrong. The first real shot across the bow was an iPad. It was the latest model, fully loaded. They presented it to her as a casual weekend gift. I had a strict rule in my house: limited screen time, especially on school nights. It was a rule they knew. When I gently reminded them of this, Trevor just chuckled. "Oh, come on, Bella. It's for her education. We can't have her falling behind in a digital world." He framed his deliberate undermining of my authority as an act of enlightened parenting. It was a subtle, brilliant maneuver. He wasn't just giving a gift, he was planting a flag, claiming territory in a life that wasn't his. Arya, of course, was ecstatic, and I was cast in the role of the strict, unfun mother. After that, Trevor's questions became more pointed, more tactical. During their weekend drop-offs, he'd engage me in casual conversation, but his words were like probes, searching for weaknesses in my defenses. "It must be tough, Bella, knowing you could be deployed at any time. What would happen to Arya then?" he'd ask, his tone dripping with false concern. "This is a fine community," he'd say, gesturing vaguely at my quiet, safe neighborhood. "But it must be a bit intense for a young girl, growing up around a military base." He was waging a campaign of psychological warfare, planting seeds of doubt and fear not only in my mind, but in Arya's. The strategy was effective. One Sunday evening after they'd left, Arya looked up at me, her face clouded with a new kind of worry. "Mom," she asked, "is California safer than here?" I knew then that this was no longer a family visit. It was an infiltration. I was outmanned and outgunned on a battlefield of wealth and influence that I didn't understand. The final offensive came a month later. They invited us to dinner at a fancy steakhouse downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and hushed, reverent waiters. The evening was a masterclass in manipulation. They were charming, attentive, lavishing praise on Arya. Towards the end of the meal, Chloe produced a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate diamond necklace. "Just a little something," she whispered, clasping it around Arya's neck. Arya was speechless, her fingers tracing the sparkling pendant. And in that moment of manufactured family bliss, Trevor made his move. He placed his wineglass down, a gesture of finality. He looked at me, his politician's smile gone, replaced by a look of cool, corporate resolve. "Bella," he said, his voice calm and level, cutting through the restaurant's quiet murmur. "We've been thinking a great deal about this. We know how much you've sacrificed. But Chloe is her biological mother, and we are in a position to give Arya a better life, a more stable life. We want to take over full custody." The words, spoken so casually between the clinking of forks and the pouring of wine, detonated in the center of my world. They were a declaration. The ceasefire was over. The peace I had fought so hard to build for 9 years had just been annihilated. The war had officially begun. The 2-hour drive from Fayetteville to Charlotte on I-85 was a blur of headlights and a churning storm in my gut. Trevor's words echoed in my head, a low-frequency hum of impending disaster. But underneath the shock, there was a sliver of desperate, naive hope, a tiny flicker I shielded against the wind. My parents, for all their emotional distance, were still my parents. They could be dismissive, they could be cold, but they couldn't possibly sanction something so monstrous. This was a line that couldn't be crossed. They couldn't endorse the kidnapping of a child disguised as a custody claim. They had to be my last line of defense, the final fallback position. I clung to that hope like a soldier clings to a trench in a firefight, whispering to myself that blood had to mean something. I pulled into the familiar driveway of the suburban brick house I grew up in, the house that was supposed to be synonymous with safety. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew I had walked into an ambush. The air was thick and heavy, stagnant with unspoken agreements, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. And there they were, sitting on my mother's floral sofa as if they owned the place, Chloe and Trevor. My parents were there too, perched uncomfortably in their armchairs, their postures stiff, pointedly avoiding my eyes. It was a perfectly staged intervention, and I was the subject. The enemy was already inside the wire. My voice shook with a rage I was struggling to contain as I laid out the situation, the calculated campaign of gifts and doubt, the psychological games, the outrageous demand Trevor had made at the restaurant. I presented the facts like a battlefield assessment, clear and concise. I looked to my father, expecting, pleading for a flicker of paternal outrage on my behalf, for him to stand up and restore order. Instead, he cleared his throat, his face a mask of detached pragmatism. "Bella, we have to be realistic here," he began, his tone maddeningly level. "We have to think of what's best for the child. Trevor is a successful businessman. Chloe? She's changed." The words were a physical blow, a stunning tactical failure, but it was my mother's voice that delivered the kill shot. She looked at me, not with sympathy, but with an expression of weary annoyance, as if I were a long-standing problem she had finally grown tired of solving. "We've known about this for a while, Bella," she said, her voice laced with reproach. "Chloe has been calling us, for the past 3 years. The floor dropped out from under me. 3 years. The words detonated in the quiet room. It wasn't just support, it was a conspiracy. A long-term, calculated deception. While I was raising Arya, attending parent-teacher conferences, nursing fevers, and building a life, they were on the phone with Chloe, listening to her curated narrative of regret, believing her polished lies. They hadn't just chosen a side, they had been secretly allied with the enemy for years. The last of my control shattered. How could you? The words tore from my throat, raw and ragged. How could you do this to me? I gave up 10 years of my life. For her? For this family? My mother's face hardened, her expression turning to ice. And what a 10 years it's been, she said, her voice dripping with venom. Your army career has made you cold, Bella. It's made you hard. Arya needs a real mother, not a commanding officer. Each word was a precision strike aimed at the very core of my identity, turning my service into a flaw. She leaned forward, her eyes merciless, delivering the final, devastating volley. You can't give her a father. Trevor can. A family should have a mother and a father, Bella. It's what's natural. And there it was, the ultimate betrayal. They weren't just taking my sister's side. They were weaponizing my sacrifice. They were taking my strength, my discipline, my entire life's work as a soldier, and twisting it into a disqualification for motherhood. They were telling me that my love, the fierce, protective, all-consuming love of a single mother, was unnatural, insufficient, wrong. My father sealed the verdict. It's time you gave back what isn't yours, Bella, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. It's the right thing to do. Something inside me snapped. The hot, searing rage vanished, extinguished in an instant. In its place, a terrifyingly calm, cold resolve settled into my bones, a core of solid ice. The tears that had been threatening to fall simply evaporated. I looked at them. These two strangers wearing the faces of my parents, my sister with her carefully rehearsed crocodile tears, and her slick, predatory husband. In that moment of absolute despair, as they all stared at me, waiting for my surrender, the words of the soldier's creed echoed in the silence of my mind. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. And I saw Arya's face, my daughter, my mission, my responsibility, my fallen comrade. My voice, when I finally spoke, was devoid of all emotion. It was as steady and cold as the steel of my rifle. I am not giving back anything, I said, my words clear and precise in the stunned silence of the room. Arya is my daughter. I locked eyes with each of them, one by one, a commander surveying a hostile force. If you want her, you'll have to go through me. I'll see you in court. I know there are people listening right now who have felt that exact sting of betrayal, when the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones holding the knife. A parent's first and most sacred duty is to protect their child. If you believe that, hit the like button for every child who deserves a protector. And in the comments, I want you to write 2 simple words that say it all. A parent protects. I turned my back on them, on the wreckage of what I once called a family, and walked out the door. The ambush had failed. The final line had been drawn. The last drop had fallen. This war, I would fight it to the very end. The drive back to Fayetteville was different. The rage was still there, a white-hot core in my chest. But it had been transformed. It was no longer a chaotic storm. It had been forged into something cold, hard, and sharp. It was fuel. War had been declared, and a soldier does not fall apart when war is declared. A soldier prepares. My grief was a luxury I couldn't afford, a piece of non-essential gear to be packed away into a footlocker in my mind, to be dealt with later. Now it was time to plan the mission. The first objective was to secure a commander. The morning after I returned to Fort Bragg, before the sun had even fully risen, I was in the waiting room of a downtown law office. Maria had given me the name. David Chen, she'd said. He's a bulldog. Used to be Army Jag. The office was small and unassuming, the air smelling of old paper and stale coffee. I sat ramrod straight on the edge of a worn vinyl chair, my hands clasped on my knees, fighting the urge to fidget. This was a different kind of vulnerability, not facing enemy fire, but preparing to expose a decade of personal pain to a complete stranger. The man who finally greeted me was not what I expected. David Chen was a compact Asian American man whose sharp, intelligent eyes seemed to assess everything at once, missing nothing. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances as I laid out the last 10 years of my life on the polished surface of his desk. He listened, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable, letting the silence hang in the air after I finished. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then he leaned forward. "Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "In the JAG Corps, we don't win cases with impassioned speeches. We win them with evidence, with witnesses. Your love for your daughter wasn't a feeling. It was a decade of actions. Our job is to make the court see that." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a shift in the tactical landscape. I wasn't a desperate mother fighting alone anymore. I was part of a command team. I had a strategist. "First thing," David said, sliding a legal pad across the desk. "We need to assemble your fire support. Make a list. Everyone who has witnessed you being a mother to Arya. Everyone." That night, I sat at my kitchen table under a single harsh light, the legal pad in front of me. This was a task I understood. I made the calls. I started with my old company commander, a man I respected immensely. Before I could even finish my clipped, professional explanation, he cut me off. "Say no more, Sergeant. Just tell me when and where." The next call was to Maria. I heard her telling her husband in the background, "Clear my schedule. Bella needs us." I called Arya's teachers at the on-base elementary school, neighbors who had watched her grow up, the wives from the FRG who had thrown me that baby shower all those years ago. The response was a tidal wave of support. Not one person hesitated. Not one person questioned. Maria's words rang in my ears like a battle cry. "Bella, you didn't just raise Arya, you became part of this fortress. We don't let people tear down our walls." They weren't just character witnesses. They were my troops, my reinforcements, ready to stand the line with me. My next meeting with David, I brought up my unease about Trevor. "His story is too perfect," I explained, the words feeling inadequate. "The tech wealth, the seamless recovery for Chloe. It feels staged. Too clean." David nodded slowly, a glint in his sharp eyes. "A good soldier always trusts their gut," he said. "It's your built-in threat detection system." He recommended a private investigator, a retired cop out in California named Frank Miller. "He's a gruff son of a bitch," David warned, "but he finds things people don't want found." The cost was staggering. I looked at my bank account online later that day. The numbers staring back represented a decade of careful saving, of foregoing vacations, of driving a 10-year-old car. It was my safety net. And in one click, I was about to cut it loose. But then I pictured Trevor's smug, confident smile, and the choice was simple. A safety net is useless if the ground beneath you is already gone. I authorized the expense without a second thought. If there was a weakness in my enemy's defenses, I needed reconnaissance to find it. That night, I pulled my old copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War from the bookshelf. "Know your enemy and know yourself," I read, "and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles." The final piece of my strategy came to me by accident. While gathering financial records for David, utility bills, grocery receipts, anything to document my life with Arya, I pulled an old metal footlocker from the back of my closet. The hinges creaked open, releasing a faint scent of cedar and old paper. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted out the first stack of documents. It was all there. Printed emails sent to my parents announcing Arya's first steps, her first words, all met with polite, one-sentence replies, or, more often, silence. Text messages from Chloe, a litany of desperate pleas for money over the years, each one promising it would be the last time. Every hospital bill from every childhood illness, every receipt for school supplies and birthday presents, every tuition payment for daycare. Each piece of paper was a silent testament to their abandonment and my commitment. I had saved them not out of spite, but as a soldier's meticulous record-keeping. But now, seeing them all together, I realized what they truly were. I brought the box to David's office. He didn't rush. He went through each document, one by one, laying them out on his conference table like a mosaic of neglect. The pile grew, a paper trail of quiet sacrifice and profound indifference. When he was finished, he looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something more than a strategist in his eyes. I saw profound respect. "Sergeant," he said, gesturing to the mountain of evidence that covered the table. "This isn't just proof, this is your story. And this," he tapped the lid of the metal box, "is our ammunition." The Fayetteville family courthouse felt less like a hall of justice and more like a sterile interrogation room. The walls were a dull beige, the air was cold, and the tension was a suffocating thing. I sat beside David Chen, my back ramrod straight, my hands clenched in my lap so tightly my knuckles were white. It felt like basic training all over again, bracing for an attack I knew was coming. Their offensive was swift and brutal. Chloe's lawyer, a slick man in a tailored suit, moved with a shark's predatory grace. He called it a non-traditional and potentially hazardous upbringing, painting my life as a soldier, not as a service, but a liability. He twisted my field training exercises into weeks of abandonment and my career into a looming threat, making our safe, loving home sound like an unstable barracks on the edge of a war zone. Then Chloe took the stand. Dressed in pristine white, she played the part of a victim perfectly. With a trembling voice and a strategically used tissue, she spun a heartbreaking tale of a decade spent yearning for the child kept from her by a controlling, military-obsessed older sister who used discipline to isolate a child from her real family. My parents followed, their faces grim and righteous as they lied under oath. With steady voices, they testified that I was difficult, had rebuffed their attempts to be involved, and always put my career before the child's needs. My own blood was systematically dismantling my life, my love, my sacrifice. I sat there, my face a mask of stone, taking the incoming fire. I didn't flinch or cry. I just absorbed each lie like a physical blow. Then, David Chen stood up. The entire dynamic of the room shifted. "The defense calls its first witness," he said calmly. "Retired Captain John Miller." My old company commander walked to the stand, his presence filling the room with an undeniable authority. He spoke of my record, my integrity, and my courage. "Sergeant Bailey," he said, his voice clear and strong, "is the most responsible soldier I've ever had the honor of commanding. When she takes on a mission, she sees it through, no matter the cost. And for the last 10 years, her most important mission has been her daughter." Next came Maria, her face a mixture of sorrow and fierce loyalty. Through tears, she told the court about the exhausted soldier she'd found struggling in the PX and how the Army wives became our family. She described the baby shower, the barbecues, the school events. "Bella didn't just raise a child," Maria cried, her voice thick with emotion. "She built a life. She built a home. She did it all by herself when her own family turned their backs." Aria's third-grade teacher followed. She presented Aria's straight-A report cards and spoke of my consistent presence at parent-teacher conferences and my volunteer work for the school bake sale. She painted a picture not of a soldier, but of a dedicated, deeply involved mother. Together, my troops, my family, had built a defensive wall of truth around me, brick by brick. It was then that I saw it. David glanced down at his phone, which had buzzed silently on the table. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. He stood up, his timing impeccable. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet courtroom. "The defense has just received new evidence of a highly critical nature. I request permission to approach the bench." The judge, a stern-faced woman with sharp eyes, nodded. A bike courier handed a sealed manila envelope to the bailiff, who passed it to David. The room held its breath. The only sound was the rustle of paper as David presented the contents to the judge. I watched her expression shift. Her eyes widened, her jaw tightened. She looked up, her gaze falling on Trevor and my parents with undisguised contempt. When she nodded, David turned to face the room. The strategist was now an executioner. "Your Honor," he began, "my client has been accused of being financially unstable. Yet, this report from a private investigator in California shows that Mr. Trevor Hayes' tech company is currently under investigation for investor fraud and is on the brink of catastrophic bankruptcy. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Trevor's face went white, the confident smirk completely erased. Chloe stared at him, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. But that's not the most important discovery, David continued, his voice dropping, forcing everyone to lean in. The investigator also found a recently probated will. It belongs to a man who passed away 6 months ago. A man who, it turns out, was Aria's biological father from a brief relationship with Ms. Chloe Bailey in college. A man who, unbeknownst to anyone, had become incredibly wealthy. A man who left his entire estate, a multi-million-dollar trust fund, to the daughter he never knew he had. The truth detonated in the silence. It was never about motherhood. It was a heist. A desperate, disgusting money grab. Before anyone could recover, David walked to our table and picked up the old metal footlocker. He placed it on the witness stand with a heavy final thud that echoed in the silent room. "And now, Your Honor," he said, his voice ringing with righteous fury, "we present a decade of love to contrast with a decade of lies." He opened the lid. He held up a printed email. An email from my client to her parents, dated 7 years ago, begging them to attend Aria's kindergarten graduation. The reply, in its entirety, "Sorry, we have a golf tournament that weekend." He held up a text message. A text from Ms. Bailey to my client, dated 4 years ago. "OMG, Bella, I'm so broke. Can you send me $500? I swear I'll pay you back." He continued, a relentless barrage of facts, reading dates and dollar amounts from medical bills, receipts for birthday presents, tuition for daycare. It was a crushing avalanche of truth. With every word, Trevor seemed to shrink. Chloe sat frozen, her face a mask of horrified realization. And my parents simply stared at the floor, their faces gray, their grand deception shattered into a million pieces at their feet. The war was over. The judge's final words landed not with the boom of an explosion, but with the quiet, profound clarity of a bell tolling in the silence after a battle. She was an older woman, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by theatrics. She didn't just dismiss Chloe's petition, she spoke directly to me, her voice resonating with a formal, powerful respect that I had spent my entire life craving from my own family. "Sergeant Bailey," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering, "you have not only served this country with honor, but you have undertaken a far greater mission with extraordinary courage. Your motherhood is not in question here. It is, in fact, the most compelling evidence presented in this court." The relief that washed over me was so immense it was almost painful. A physical weight lifting from my chest that I didn't realize I had been carrying for 10 years. It was validation. Not just a legal victory, but a declaration of my worth from an impartial arbiter of the truth. It was the recognition my own parents had never been capable of giving me. The war was over, but now came the difficult part. Clearing the battlefield. As we were leaving the courtroom, my parents intercepted us in the hallway. The change in them was shocking. They looked defeated. All the righteous certainty had been stripped away, leaving them looking frail and 10 years older. My father stepped forward, his face etched with a confusion that bordered on despair. "Bella, he began, his voice raspy, but I held up a hand, a gesture that was both a halt and a shield. The rage was gone. The hurt was still there, a deep, foundational ache. But the fire had burned out, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. "There's nothing left to say," I said, my voice even and calm, devoid of the anger they were likely expecting. It was the voice I used on the training field, the one for delivering orders, not for arguments. "Aria and I are staying in Fort Bragg. This is our home." I looked them both in the eye, ensuring they understood the finality of my words. "If you want to be a part of her life, it will be on my terms. There will be no more expensive gifts to buy her affection. There will only be time and sincerity. And trust," I added, letting the word hang in the air between us, "will take a very long time to rebuild." I didn't wait for a reply. I saw the flicker of protest in my mother's eyes, the crumbling devastation on my father's face, but I didn't engage. I took Arya's small hand in mine, squeezed it, and walked away, leaving them standing in the echoing silence of the courthouse corridor. A week later, a letter arrived. The envelope had no return address, but I recognized Chloe's looping, dramatic handwriting immediately. Inside, the pages were stained with what I assumed were tears. Trevor was gone, she wrote. He had vanished the day after the hearing, leaving her to face the consequences of their failed scheme and his mountain of debt alone. She wrote about her weakness, her selfishness, about how easily she had let Trevor manipulate her dreams of a perfect family into a greedy, ugly plot. The letter was a long, rambling confession of a life lived in the shadow of her own inadequacies. The last line was scrawled at the bottom, almost an afterthought. I never deserved to be her mom, she wrote. You were always her mom, Bella. I folded the letter and set it on the kitchen counter. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a profound, weary sadness for the broken little girl who was still trapped inside my sister's body, the girl who had never learned to take responsibility for her own life. My great-aunt, a woman of deep faith, used to quote the Bible to me, "The truth will set you free." The truth had been my weapon in court, and it had won me my freedom. But seeing Chloe's words, I realized the truth hadn't set her free. It had just left her alone in a prison of her own making. I didn't reply to the letter, but I didn't throw it away either. I tucked it into the back of a drawer. For another day. Maybe. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns of our neighborhood, I sat with Arya on our front steps. We were sharing a pint of her favorite ice cream, mint chocolate chip, passing it back and forth between us with one spoon. The air was warm, filled with the familiar sounds of kids playing down the street and the distant, rhythmic thud of artillery practice. Fort Bragg's lullaby, now restored to its comforting cadence. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, just watching the world go by. Then, Arya leaned her head against my shoulder, her small body relaxed and content. "Is it over, Mom?" she asked, her voice a small whisper. "Is everything okay now?" I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close, the sweet smell of mint and chocolate filling the air. I looked out at the peaceful twilight descending on our world, our fortress, our home. I felt the solid weight of her against me, the steady beat of her heart, and the unshakable certainty of our bond. A bond forged in abandonment and tempered in the fires of a long, hard-fought war. The year that followed the trial was a year of quiet reconstruction. The storm had passed, and we were left to rebuild on the solid ground we had defended. Life fell into a new, peaceful cadence. The ripples of the court case had unexpectedly opened a new door for me in the Army. My command, having seen my resilience and dedication firsthand, promoted me to Sergeant First Class and offered me a new position, one I never would have imagined. I became a lead counselor for the base's Family Readiness Group, advising young military families navigating the unique pressures of this life. The very experiences that were once used as weapons against me, my single motherhood, my career, my struggles, had been reforged into my greatest assets. I was still a soldier, but my battlefield had changed. Instead of training troops for combat, I was helping them build their own fortresses of communication, resilience, and love. The lines of communication with my own family remained strained, but there were attempts. My parents called every Sunday, their voices hesitant, stripped of their old authority. They didn't offer advice or judgment anymore. They just asked about Arya's school, her friends, her latest art project. It was a fragile, tentative bridge, but it was a start. Chloe would send sporadic, unsigned greeting cards, a birthday card, a Christmas card, with no return address. They were small, anonymous gestures, the actions of someone wanting to be remembered without having to be known. I taught Arya about forgiveness, but I taught her the soldier's version of it. "We can forgive them for their weakness, honey," I told her one afternoon as we looked at one of Chloe's cards. "But we also have the right to protect our peace. Forgiveness doesn't mean you let them back inside the wire to cause more harm. It means you let go of the anger, for yourself, so it doesn't weigh you down." She nodded, a serious, thoughtful expression on her face that was so much older than her years. She understood. She was, after all, a soldier's daughter. On her 11th birthday, Arya gave me a small, flat box wrapped in blue paper. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, were 2 military-style dog tags, freshly engraved. I picked them up, the cool metal heavy in my hand. The first one read, SFC Bella Bailey. My new rank, my name. I smiled, touched by her thoughtfulness. But it was the second one that made my breath catch in my throat. It had only 2 words on it. Arya's mom. And underneath that, a single, powerful line. The most important mission. Tears welled in my eyes as I slipped the chain over my head. The 2 small pieces of metal lay against my chest, heavier and more precious than any medal I'd ever earned or could ever hope to earn. For a decade, I had been searching for validation from people who were incapable of giving it. I had fought a war for recognition from a family who refused to see me, and here it was. The only commendation that ever truly mattered, given to me by the one person whose opinion was the law of my universe. It was the ultimate acknowledgement, the final, unconditional acceptance. That evening, we sat on our front porch, just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the North Carolina sky in shades of orange and purple. At exactly 1700 hours, the first clear, mournful note of a bugle cut through the air. The sound of retreat. All across Fort Bragg, the world came to a quiet, respectful halt. Cars stopped in the middle of the road. Soldiers walking across the parade ground froze in place, turning to face the flag. Children playing in their yards stopped and stood at attention. Arya and I stood up from the porch steps. We placed our right hands over our hearts and watched as the American flag began its slow, dignified journey down the pole on the main parade ground across the way. 10 years ago, that sound, the evening bugle call, had been the soundtrack to my loneliness, a nightly reminder of my isolation. Now it was something else entirely. It was the rhythm of our life, the cadence of our home. It was the sound of a promise kept, of a duty fulfilled, of a peace that had been hard won. As the last note faded into the twilight and the flag was carefully folded, I looked down at my daughter. My beautiful, resilient, incredible daughter. We had been a fire team of 2, abandoned on the battlefield. We had faced down the enemy, held the line, and survived. More than survived. We had built a new definition of family, not on the fragile bonds of blood, but on the unbreakable pillars of loyalty, sacrifice, and love, the very values a soldier understands best. This was our fortress. This was our home. The mission was, finally and truly, accomplished. My story with Arya has found its peace, but I know my journey is not unique. So many of us have had to fight battles no one sees, redefine what family truly means, and build our own fortresses of love and loyalty. This space is for all of us, the protectors, the survivors, the ones who found strength in the fire. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. Your support helps bring more stories like this to light. For one last time, let me know in the comments. What is one word that defines the family you chose or built?